Bom, gente, então, sem mais demoras, eu queria convidar aqui para compor a próxima mesa, Neoliberalismo hoje e perspectivas pós-neoliberais. O nosso palestrante principal do evento, o professor Gary Gerstle. O professor Gary Gerstle é Paul Mellon, Professor of American History, Emeritus na Universidade de Cambridge, autor e editor de mais de 10 livros, incluindo The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, American the World in the Free Market Era. Ele é colunista do The Guardian e aparece frequentemente na BBC, NPR e em podcasts. Neste ano, ele está atuando como Fellow em Harvard, no Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. E chamar também para a mesa o professor Marcos Nobre. O Marcos Nobre é diretor-geral do CCI SEBRAP, um dos seus pesquisadores principais. Ele é professor titular de Filosofia Política da Unicamp e coordena diversos projetos temáticos financiados pela FAPESP. Ele recebeu o Prêmio Jabuti de Melhor Livro em Ciências Sociais, por Limites da Democracia, de junho de 2013, ao governo Bolsonaro.
Para nós é uma enorme honra e alegria ter o professor Gary Gerstle conosco, que acabou de retornar do Reino Unido, após 10 anos no Reino Unido, retornou para os Estados Unidos, retornou no momento certo. A resistência nos Estados Unidos precisa de todo mundo, em especial de intelectuais como ele. Então, atualmente ele está na Fundação Harvard Radcliffe como Fellow, um Joy Foundation Fellow. Ele recebeu muitos prêmios por vários livros e eu destacaria American Crucible, Raça e Nação no século XX, e também Liberty and Coercion, o paradoxo do governo americano, da fundação até o momento presente. Só para dar uma ideia para vocês da vastidão do conhecimento dele e da profundidade histórica com que ele trata esses temas. Eu conheci o trabalho do professor Gerstle por causa de um livro que ele editou junto com Steve Fraser em 1989, chamado The Rise and Fall of the New Deal Order, né? Que é uma coletânea, e foi ali pela primeira vez que ele elaborou o conceito de ordem, em especial o conceito de ordem política, que então está nessa coletânea e que também vai ser o conceito central do livro de 2022, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, né? Essa breve introdução que eu faço aqui também para dizer que, se tiver algum editor presente, que, por favor, traduza o livro do professor Gerstle para o português, porque, se nós tivéssemos livros assim em todos os países, realmente nós teríamos uma capacidade de compreensão do neoliberalismo muito superior. Porque o que dá riqueza e profundidade a esse livro é o fato de ele estar ancorado firmemente na história dos Estados Unidos. E, como sempre, a gente consegue encontrar vários paralelos nas análises do professor Gerstle. No momento, ele está trabalhando num novo livro, estamos ansiosos para que venha. Eu acho que o working title, né, o título provisório, é Politics in Our Time. E nós esperamos, então, que a gente possa, com essa conferência, entender melhor o que foi o neoliberalismo e, a partir daí, abrir horizontes do pós-neoliberalismo. Eu farei brevíssimos comentários após a conferência do professor Gerstle, apenas para iniciar o debate, claro, com o limite de horário que a gente tem. Tá certo? Professor Gerstle, muito obrigado de ter aceito o nosso convite e, por favor, estamos aqui para ouvi-lo.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Thank you very much, Marcos, for that wonderful introduction. It's my first time in Sao Paulo. It's wonderful to be here. I'm tired, and I get to speak, which is easier than listening after this long day. So I thank you for your forbearance. I want to thank CBRAP for the invitation, CCI, Marcos, Camelia, Marilia. I came here not just to speak, I came here to learn. And I've learned so much today already. I'm going to speak mostly about the United States in my remarks, but it's going to be in an international context. And I think it follows quite beautifully from the wonderful session we just had on Bolsonaro, because the new right, the old right, the big right in Brazil, because the connection between Brazil and the United States now in terms of developments is just so important. I also want to give a shout out to the translators. I don't think they've been thanked yet, but this is not easy work. Under communism, socialism, capitalism, it's just not easy work. And I've had my earphones on most of the day, and I think they've just done brilliantly. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to stick very closely to a prepared text. It'll go more quickly that way, and it will also get the translators through their last chore of the day. Across the second decade of the 20th century, the tectonic plates structuring politics and life in the United States began to shift. Even before the pandemic struck, developments that 10 years earlier would have been inconceivable now dominated politics and popular consciousness. The election of Donald Trump and the launch of a presidency like no other, the rise of Bernie Sanders and the resurrection of a socialist left, the sudden and deep questioning of open borders and free trade, the surge of populism and ethno-nationalism, and the castigation of once celebrated globalizing elites. The decline of Barack Obama's stature and the transformational promise that his presidency once embodied for so many, and the widening conviction that the American political system was no longer working and that American democracy was in crisis, a crisis that the January 6, 2021 assault by a mob on the Capitol so shockingly dramatized. In this dizzying array of political developments, and I've been studying this dizzying array for a long time, I've been living it, you've been living it, we're still trying to understand it. This is my best effort. I discern the fall, or at least the fracturing, of a political order that took shape in the 1970s and 80s and achieved dominance in the 1990s and first decade of the 21st century. I call this formation a neoliberal order in the United States. Republican Ronald Reagan was its ideological architect. Democrat Bill Clinton was its key facilitator. The book that I have recently published is a history of this political order's rise and fall. It attempts to offer a history of our time. The phrase political order is meant to connote a constellation of ideologies, policies, and constituencies that shape American politics in ways that endure beyond the 2-, 4-, and 6-year election cycles. In the last 100 years, the United States has had two political orders: the New Deal order that arose in the 1930s and 40s, crested in the 1950s and 60s, and fell in the 1970s, and the neoliberal order that arose in the 1970s and 80s, crested in the 1990s and 2000s, and fell in the 20-teens. At the heart of each of these two political orders across the last 100 years stood a distinctive program of political economy. The New Deal order was founded on the conviction that capitalism, left to its own devices, spelled economic disaster. It had to be managed by a strong central state able to govern the economy in the public interest. The neoliberal order, by contrast, was grounded in the belief that market forces had to be liberated from government controls that were stymieing growth, innovation, and freedom. The architects of the neoliberal order set out in the 1980s and 1990s to dismantle everything that the New Deal order had built across its 40-year span. Now the neoliberal order, too, is being dismantled. The key challenge for us today, the reason we have been gathered, the reason I am here, is to try and figure out what will replace the neoliberal order. Will it be a new political order of the right or of the left, or will the current period of extended volatility and chaos continue into the future? I don't know the answer to these questions. You can send me home now and start your evening prematurely, but I hope my remarks today will help illuminate the present condition of domestic and global politics and what the futures of both might look like. My remarks will unfold as follows. First, I want to define what I mean by political order and what I mean by neoliberalism. Second, I will discuss the circumstances that permitted a neoliberal order to triumph in the 1990s. Third, I will explore why the neoliberal order fell apart in the 20-teens, ushering in a period of sustained political volatility, much of it driven by populist anger on the right. And finally, I will offer some speculations about what the politics of the present and future may hold. What is a political order? A political order in the United States signifies that a political party has found an enduring way of organizing a nation's political life. Its core political ideas, especially regarding political economy, come to be regarded as consensual, even hegemonic, exercising influence throughout the polity, far beyond the ranks of the party's supporters. Establishing a political order demands far more than winning an election or two. It requires deep-pocketed donors to invest in promising candidates over the long term. It requires the establishment of think tanks and policy networks to turn political ideas into actionable programs. It requires a rising political party able to durably win over multiple electoral constituencies. It must have a capacity to shape political opinion both at the highest levels, think the Supreme Court, and across popular print and broadcast media. And it must have a moral perspective able to inspire voters with vision of the good life. Political orders, in other words, are complex projects that demand advances across a broad front. New ones do not arise very often. Usually they appear when an older order founders amidst an economic crisis that then precipitates a governing crisis. The Great Recession of the 1970s precipitated the fall of the New Deal order. The global financial crash of 2008-2009 triggered the fracturing of the neoliberal order. A key attribute of a political order is the ability of its ideologically dominant party to bend the opposition party to its will. Bending of this sort comes to be perceived as necessary within the ranks of politicians competing for the top prizes of American politics, the presidency and control of Congress. Thus, in the 1950s, the Republican Party of Dwight D. Eisenhower acquiesced to the core principles of the New Deal order. And in the 1990s, the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton accepted the central principles of the neoliberal order. Acceptance, excuse me, let me have maintain my voice here. Acceptance is never complete. There are always points of tension and vulnerability in a polity as disparate as the American one. And yet the success of a political order depends on its proficiency in shaping what broad majorities of elected officials and voters on both sides of the partisan divide regard as politically possible and desirable. By the same token, losing the capacity to exercise ideological hegemony signals a political order's decline. In these moments of decline, political ideas and programs formerly regarded as radical, heterodox, or unworkable, or dismissed as the product of the overheated imaginations of fringe groups on the right and left, are able to move from the margins into the mainstream. This happened in the 1970s when the breakup of the New Deal order allowed long-scorned neoliberal ideas. And we have to remember that neoliberal ideas were long scorned. Sometimes we forget that. When the breakup of the New Deal order allowed long scorned neoliberal ideas for reorganizing the economy to take root. It happened again in the 20-teens when the coming apart of the neoliberal order opened up space for Trump-style authoritarianism on the right and Bernie Sanders-style socialism on the left to flourish. To describe the sort of dominance that a political order can achieve, I sometimes invoke Gramsci's concept of hegemony. Bending the opposition party to a dominant party's will corresponds to Gramsci's analysis of how a set of ideas can become so authoritative and powerful that they come to seem part of the natural order of things. Some coercion is inevitably involved in bending the opposition, but key to a hegemonic project's success is the seeming willingness of institutions and individuals to acquiesce, even to embrace, a set of ideas seen as defining what is politically desirable and or possible. In defining how particular ideas come to dominate political discourse, my work also draws on Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. Kuhn was a philosopher of science who popularized the concept of paradigm as a way of describing how certain ideas, certain ways of seeing the world become so dominant that they appear to offer the only way of understanding reality. A paradigm becomes not just a lens, but the only lens through which we apprehend what we see. Kuhn conceived of paradigms as comprising structures of scientific knowledge, but those who have read and been influenced by Kuhn have extended the paradigm idea to analyze not just scientific thought, but political thought as well. During the New Deal era, the conviction that government had to manage capitalism in the public interest became paradigmatic. During the neoliberal era, the conviction that capitalism had to be released from its fetters became equally paradigmatic. What is neoliberalism? How many hours do you have? We all carry around a notion of what neoliberalism is, so you may think we don't need to discuss it. But the term until recently has been little used in the United States. In order to persuade American readers and thinkers of the term's utility, I had to define what it meant and also to show why it was superior to other terms that people in the United States have been using to discuss certain political ideas and formations. In defining neoliberalism, I developed an understanding of neoliberalism that diverged in some respects from more orthodox and conventional interpretations. That's my warning sign. Neoliberalism is a creed that prizes free trade and the free movement of capital, goods, and people. It celebrates deregulation as an economic good that results when markets are freed from governmental interference. It hails globalization as a win-win position that both enriches the West, the cockpit of neoliberalism, while also bringing an unprecedented level of prosperity to the rest of the world. These creedal principles deeply shaped U.S. politics during the heyday of the neoliberal order. Neoliberalism, in my view, is built on the principles of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, born in the 18th century, discerned in markets extraordinary dynamism and possibilities for generating trade, wealth, and a rising standard of living. Classical liberalism sought to liberate markets from encumbrances, from monarchy, from mercantilism, from bureaucracy, from artificial borders, from tariffs. It sought, in other words, to release the economy from the heavy hand of the state in its various guises. It wanted to allow people to move around in pursuit of self-interest and fortune. In the view of the Scottish economist Adam Smith, classical liberalism was intent on creating an economy in which individuals were free to truck, barter, and trade as they saw fit. Classical liberalism wanted to let individual talent rise or fall to its natural level. It carried within it emancipatory, even utopian hopes of people freed and a world transformed. My argument for treating neoliberalism as a descendant of classical liberalism puts me at odds with some scholars of neoliberalism who have emphasized the differences between the two. The most common argument for distinction is that neoliberalism, in order to reinvigorate markets, requires far more state intervention than classical liberalism ever did. I agree with the claim that strong states are necessary to organize vibrant markets, but I dispute the contention that the turn to strong states was a development that only began with the advent of neoliberalism. The excellent work done these last 20 years by historians of the 19th century U.S. state has revealed how the presence of a strong government with the ability to set down and enforce rules for making contracts, and with the capacity to expand and protect markets through law, military force, and tariffs, was critical to the success of classical liberalism in 19th century America. Flourishing markets then and now require strong governments that can enforce rules of economic exchange. Markets need structure in order to operate freely. This principle was as intrinsic to classical liberalism as it has been to neoliberalism. Recognizing the close kinship between classical liberalism and neoliberalism allows us to see how some who embraced neoliberal principles in the late 20th century sought to resuscitate the promise of emancipation and individuality that was so central to classical liberalism itself. My argument that neoliberalism embodies this promise has aroused skepticism among those who regard neoliberalism as the work exclusively of elites and their allies aspiring to economic and political power. Those who figure centrally in elite-driven models of neoliberalism are often influential intellectuals, or deep-pocketed billionaires in the think tanks they support, or financial institutions such as the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, operating largely free of democratic oversight. Neoliberalism, from this point of view, is configured as the enemy of the people and framed as a tool used by elites to subvert democracy and to undercut emancipatory movements both in their own nations and overseas. Interpretively, these works are driven by the conviction that elites have been the creators and disseminators of neoliberal thought and practice. Neoliberalism undeniably has a strong elitist element, developing mechanisms of coercion to impose market discipline on a society is a central part of its project. Neoliberals have also been largely indifferent to questions of economic inequality and to the need for wealth distribution. But I also insist in my work that an elite-driven model for understanding neoliberalism cannot account for the popularity that its views achieved in the United States. Ronald Reagan convinced many Americans that joining his political crusade would unshackle the economy from regulation and make them free. He framed that freedom as every American's birthright. The pursuit of that freedom, he told his followers, was the reason the American Revolution had been fought, the reason the U.S. nation had come into existence. Reagan resuscitated the emancipatory language of classical liberalism for a late 20th century audience, an act of recovery that helped to make him one of America's most popular presidents of the 20th century. Seeking out the sources of his popularity requires moving beyond elite-based understandings of neoliberalism and inquiring into the reasons why individuals up and down the social scale were drawn to Reagan-style neoliberal rhetoric and policies. In my own quest to understand neoliberalism's popularity in the United States, I uncovered sources of its appeal not just on the right, but on the left as well. The left that I focused on was the so-called New Left, a constellation of radical liberation movements that emerged in the 1960s and distinct from the socialist and communist parties that had dominated left politics in the 1930s and 40s. While New Leftists thought of themselves as bitterly opposed to Reagan and everything he represented, it is possible to discern areas of overlap between their politics and his. Let me explain. The New Left of the 60s and 70s was as concerned about excessive government bureaucracy as it was by capital accumulation. In their view, corporate America and the federal government had merged into one gigantic and exploitative system, and that was the term used at the time, that undercut the possibilities for personal and human freedom. From the point of view of these New Leftists, bloated government bureaucracies that had emerged from the New Deal had done as much to stultify personal freedom as had corporate tyranny. Their cry against excessive regulation, against the bureaucratic tyranny that was thought to suppress human creativity, can be discerned in so much of their literature and speeches. It is there in Paul Goodman's Cri de Coeur, Growing Up Absurd. It is present in the 1962 Port Huron Statement that defined the early goals of the New Left. It is central to the rhetoric that Mario Savio used to frame the ambitions of the University of California's 1964 free speech movement, an early New Left moment of mass mobilization. It is there in the hippie-inflected movement for computer innovation that inspired individuals like Steve Jobs, then a 110% hippie living in the American Northwest, to associate the creation of the personal computer with the quest for individual freedom. And it is there in the determination of reformer Ralph Nader and his political allies to free the consumer from repressive corporate and government elites, freeing the individual and his or her consciousness from the grip of large stultifying institutions, privileging disruption over order, celebrating cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism, and the unexpected sorts of mixing and hybridities that emerge under these regimes. Each of these campaigns marinated for years in the political and cultural milieu inspired by the New Left. I argue that these campaigns unintentionally furthered neoliberal aspirations and helped to make it into a hegemonic ideological force. Ideas of neoliberalism then were incubating in the 1960s and 70s on both the left and the right. They broke with force onto American society in the 1980s with the ascension of Ronald Reagan to the presidency. Still, this neoliberal project likely would not have achieved hegemony and would likely not have succeeded as a political order, but for one additional development that happened well beyond US borders in the late 80s and early 90s, the fall of the Soviet Union and the abandonment of the communist dream. That's kind of a big shift in the essay, so take a moment to absorb that. Why the collapse of the Soviet Union matters. Few international events in the 20th century matched the Russian Revolution of 1917 in importance. In the 50 years after their rise to power in Russia, communists walled off large parts of the world, the vast Soviet Union, then half of Europe, and then China, from capitalist economics. For the first third of the Cold War era, communism was a serious threat in Western Europe. For the first two-thirds of the Cold War, it posed a similar threat across innumerable nations emerging in Africa and Asia, and among long-established nations in the Caribbean and in Central and South America. Fascism and Nazism can be understood in part as radical right responses to communism's rise. Meanwhile, in the United States, from the 1920s forward, communism was regarded as a mortal threat to the American way of life. The Great Depression and the Second World War moderated America's anti-communism, but only temporarily. No other single political force had a comparable influence on world or American politics across the 20th century. The power of the communist threat and the fear it unleashed is now largely forgotten in the global north. I'll be interested to see how much it's been forgotten in the global south. I suspect considerably less so. The students who I have taught, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, across the last 20 years, regard the Cold War as quaint. Few accounts of neoliberalism treat the fall of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991, or the collapse of communism, as capitalism's chief global antagonist as seminal events. But the consequences of that empire's fall and the simultaneous defeat of its legitimating ideology were immense. Together, they made possible neoliberalism's American and global triumph. One consequence of communism's fall is obvious. It opened a large part of the world, Russia and Eastern Europe, to capitalist penetration. It also dramatically widened the willingness of China, still nominally a communist state in the 1990s, to experiment with capitalist economics. Capitalism thus became global in the 1990s in a way it had not been since prior to the First World War. The globalized world that dominated international affairs in the 1990s and 2000s is unimaginable apart from communism's collapse. Another consequence of communist fall may be less obvious but is of equal importance. It removed what had been an imperative in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere for class compromise between capitalist elites and the working classes. From the 1930s through the 1960s, communism was understood by its opponents through the lens of totalitarianism. meaning it was regarded as a totalizing system of rule that once established could never be overthrown. The influential theory of totalitarianism taught that a nation lost to communism would never be regained for the capitalist world. Thus, the specter of communist advance required from the United States a policy of military containment unprecedented in its history. It also impelled capitalist elites in advanced industrial countries, including the United States, to compromise with their class antagonists in ways they would not otherwise have done. The fear of communism made the class compromise between capital and labor that underwrote much of the New Deal order. It made possible class compromises in many social democracies in Europe after the Second World War. The collapse of communism then cleared the world of capitalism's most ardent opponent. Vast new territories and peoples could now be brought into a single capitalist marketplace. The possibilities for growth and profit seemed boundless. The United States would benefit from this growth, of course, and perhaps the class compromise that had formed the basis of the New Deal order could be jettisoned. There was no longer a hard left to fear. The precise timing of the fall of the Soviet Union and of communism more generally, 1989 to 1991, explains why the 1990s were a more decisive decade in neoliberalism's triumph than the 1980s had been, and why Bill Clinton's role in securing neoliberalism's triumph was in some ways more important than that of Reagan himself. After 1991, the pressure on capitalist elites and their supporters to compromise with the working class vanished. The room for political maneuver by class-based progressive forces narrowed dramatically. The weakening of America's welfare state and the labor movement marched in tandem with communism's collapse. This is the moment when neoliberalism went from being a political movement to a political order. The fall of communism, in short, was critical to neoliberalism's triumph. To argue for communism's importance is not meant to rehabilitate it as a political movement. Communism, to me, is an indefensible system of tyranny. Rather, it is meant to help us to understand the role that communism played in the century when it was a feared force, and then to call on us to reckon with the effects of its sudden and complete disappearance from international and national affairs. The very real communist threat in the period from the 1930s to the 1960s facilitated the class compromise between capital and labor that sustained the New Deal order. The disappearance of that threat between 1989 and 1991 facilitated the scuttling of that compromise and the triumph of the neoliberal order. This perspective underscores the importance of situating the history of neoliberalism and the political order it sustained in the broader context of the epic 75-year global struggle between capitalism and communism. What brought the neoliberal order down? The neoliberal order fractured in the second decade of the 21st century. Confidence in the virtues of free markets and globalization, in the good that would result from releasing capitalism from its constraints, plummeted. The immediate cause for the collapse of this political order was the great financial crash of 2008 and 2009 and the damage it did to the global economy. But the deeper cause was that the neoliberal order had made a series of promises about economic development, abundance, and the good life that it could not keep. The neoliberal order had promised to release capitalism from regulatory constraints, to abolish all obstacles to free trade and the free movement of people, and to power economic growth and prosperity everywhere, not just in North America, but in Europe, not just in the global north, but in the global south as well. The champions of the neoliberal order acknowledged that this system of global capitalism would likely widen the gap between the rich and poor. They also insisted, however, that such a gap would not matter much, for the neoliberal order would unleash a rising economic tide that would lift all boats. The poor would see their incomes rise. Tens of millions of individuals would have the opportunity to vault themselves into a secure middle-class existence that had long been beyond their grasp. There would be no losers in this neoliberal world, or so the ideology declared. Workers would benefit as well as employers. The countries of the global south would benefit as would those of the global north. The neoliberal order delivered on some of its promises, most notably in raising up middle classes of ample size and security in broad swaths of the developing world, including in Turkey, India, China, Korea, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico. But the stimulation of economic growth in these countries often stripped it away from the global north. Manufacturing sectors proliferating in the global south were producing goods far more cheaply than was the case in the global north. Between the 1980s and 20-teens, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and other industrialized countries lost millions of manufacturing jobs to the global south, to the point where whole industries, textiles, steel, electrical machinery, electronics, chemical products, and so on, were hollowed out, as were the cities and regions in which these industries had once flourished. Newer industries in the global north, such as those emerging from the IT revolution, either failed to generate sufficient jobs relative to those that have been lost, or themselves outsourced production to districts of the global south. Thus, for example, 21st century China, not the US, became the hub for manufacturing jobs generated by insatiable global demand for Apple computers and iPhones. The declining fortunes of the working classes of the global north have been well documented. In the United States, intergenerational social mobility had been a hallmark of economic and social life since the 1940s, especially for white working class America. Children could expect to improve on their parents' educational attainment, labor force skills, and economic standing. These indicators reversed in the 1990s as the younger generations began falling short of their parents' achievements. By the 20-teens, what the economists Angus Deaton and Ann Case called deaths of despair, those arising from alcoholism, drugs, and suicide, began to soar among white, male, middle-aged Americans, triggering a historic reversal in life expectancy in this cohort. Despair among white men was worsened by the perceived racial implications of the white working class's decline. The globalized world of free trade had not only stripped white workers of their jobs and prosperity, it also appeared to be handing those jobs and hopeful futures to people of color in China, Southeast Asia, India, and Latin America. W.E.B. Du Bois, a leading African-American scholar, critic, and spokesperson of the 20th century's first half, had once written that white workers had long benefited from what he called a psychological wage. By this, he meant that white workers, however poor they may have been, occupied positions of privilege as members of America's white race. This rank did not ease their poverty, but it certainly, Du Bois argued, enhanced their status. The privilege of whiteness has long had an international dimension, manifest in the way that Europe and America had for centuries dominated Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and large stretches of South America. The breakup of Western empires and the emergence of independent states across Asia and Africa in the decades after World War II had, of course, eroded this domination. Nevertheless, airs of superiority lived on, so much so that many members of the white working class in the global north, even into the 21st century, had trouble accepting the reversal of fortune that was becoming manifest, that people of color in formerly subjugated and colonized lands were now prospering in ways that once privileged whites in Western countries no longer were. This reversal of fortune was evident not just from observations of the dynamic growth rates manifesting themselves in developing countries. It was also evident closer to home, where metropoles in the United States and Western Europe seemed to be filling up with people of color, the result of the relatively open borders regimes that prevailed during the neoliberal heyday. 35 million immigrants came to the United States between the 1970s and 20-teens. The mass movement of people that a globalized neoliberal order had unleashed, with tens of millions of people now migrating in search of both economic opportunity and freedom, facilitated political developments that were once thought unimaginable. In the United States, a black man with a Muslim name, Barack Hussein Obama, assembled a multicultural political movement in 2008 strong enough to send him to the White House. In Western Europe, masses of Muslim migrants began to assert their beliefs and demand autonomy for their ways of life and nations, still cherishing the continent's historic Christian character, a character that still mattered existentially, even as the percentage of church-going Christians in Western Europe had shrunk to low double digits. Many whites in America and Western Europe thus feared that they were not simply losing the economic competition with the lesser peoples defined by race and/or religion. They feared that they were losing as well the ability to sustain their nation's long-standing ethno-racial character. Declining economic fortune and democratic eclipse went hand in hand, generating a tidal wave of fear among whites that their families and nations were being stripped of their future. In the United States, Donald Trump rode this wave to the White House in 2016, pledging to halt and then reverse what he called in a memorably notorious phrase, American carnage. Making America great again was never just about economics. It was also about race. Trump did not simply attack immigrants of color in the United States. He also charged that America's national crisis was being orchestrated by a global elite with loyalty to no nation and to no one sitting lower in the social order. These globalists, as both Trump advisor Steve Bannon and historian Quinn Slobodian have called them, and apologies to Quinn for putting him in the same sentence as Steve Bannon, had made the decision to open economies to global trade regardless of the domestic consequences. They were getting immensely rich from globalization, even as substantial parts of their countries of residence were rotting. They were thought to delight in the mixing of cultures, peoples, and sexualities that came to characterize the metropoles of the global economies, and they were seen to smirk with barely disguised contempt at countrymen and women who preferred more traditional lifestyles marked by ethnic and religious homogeneity, by heterosexuality, and by the conviction that when God created the world, he made a gender binary, the one distinguishing Adam from Eve, foundational to it. Anger and resentment spread across the real and metaphorical countryside as its residents feared that globalists were using ill-gotten wealth and power to promote cosmopolitanism and other elements of the latter's radical cultural agenda. When economic disaster struck this neoliberal world in 2008, 2009, the globalists, in the eyes of their critics, made sure to take care of their own people first. In nation after nation, governments took it upon themselves to save the banks that had triggered economic crisis in the first place. Then and only then did governments do something for the millions who had lost their jobs and homes. People noticed that government policy virtually everywhere seemed to be biased toward the rich. They observed that those with stock market assets had recouped their financial losses by 2011 and 12, whereas those without such assets continued to struggle mightily across the entirety of the new century's second decade. Ordinary citizens began to believe that financial elites had burrowed their way deeply into states, corrupting governments profoundly. Ordinary politics no longer sufficed. Too many parties and political leaders had been co-opted. National parliaments seemed unable to solve the problems that a globalized capitalist and free trade world had generated. These national parliaments had become part of the problem and thus could not assist with finding a solution. The swamp, to use Trump's terminology, had to be drained. Virtually all the great populist explosions erupted in the decade following the 2008-2009 financial crash. The Tea Party in America, 2010, the ascension of Orban in Hungary, 2010, the rise of the National Front in France, 2012 and 2017, the election of Modi in India, 2014, Britain choosing to leave Europe, 2016, the election of Trump in the US, 2016, and the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, 2018. Each of these explosions had national particularities, but they shared many features, including a yearning for a strong man or woman to come in and blow up politics as usual. Someone needed to knock heads together to disrupt the deep state, to dispense with democratic niceties, and perhaps dispense with liberal democracy altogether. These dramatic steps were necessary in order to restore fairness, opportunity, hope. It's important to say that insurrectionary sentiment during the 21st century's second decade arose not just on the right, but on the left. Occupy Wall Street erupted in New York in 2011, targeting globalists and capitalists the world over. Bernie Sanders reignited a socialist movement in the US in 2016, mirroring on the left Trump's success on the right. And Jeremy Corbyn, for the first time in decades, made the left a formidable force in British politics in 2017. The consequent flow of heterodox ideas on the right and left into mainstream politics is exactly what we would expect to see as a dominant political order was breaking up. This ideological ferment led to a profound change in the character of politics in many nations. In the United States, it manifested itself in Trump's rejection of key neoliberal ideas, including free trade and globalization. It manifested itself, too, in the Bernie Sanders-Joe Biden alliance that powered Joe Biden and the Democrats to victory in 2020. That alliance yielded a political program that broke decisively with the neoliberal politics of Biden's two Democratic predecessors, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Biden not only kept Trump's tariffs in place, but made the kind of massive government investments in infrastructure, green energy, and chips manufacture that Democrats and Republicans during the neoliberal heyday had rejected. Neoliberals believed that markets were superior to governments in allocating investments, stimulating economic growth, and producing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But Democrats under Biden abandoned this worship of the market, seeking instead to use government power to manage markets and economies in the public interest. The Biden administration also launched vigorous antitrust initiatives to constrain or break up concentrations of corporate power in America. The Biden administration viewed itself, and it's important to remind us of this at this moment as they ride off into the sunset, as pushing into existence a new and progressive political order, what they variously called Bidenomics, the Green New Deal, and the Big Deal. They still need a better name for it. Trump's presidential victory 2 weeks ago has delivered a formidable blow to Biden's would-be political order. There is now talk of a Trump political order, one marked by authoritarianism, granting the president unbounded executive power, and a resurgent neoliberalism that aggressively resuscitates private enterprise and frees it from the grasp of a tyrannical or deep regulatory state. Despite Trump's impressive victory, however, building a political order along Trumpian lines will be no easy matter. Protectionist trade policies and restrictive immigration policies, if adopted, will involve the Trump administration in precisely the kind of intervention in markets that rhetorically he and his lieutenants have pledged to avoid. What if Trump is successful in limiting immigration on anything close to the scale he has outlined? Then the U.S. labor market will tighten dramatically. I'm talking deporting 10 to 15 million people from the United States. The U.S. labor market will tighten dramatically, substantially enhancing the leverage that American workers would have in their negotiations with employers. A long slumbering American labor movement is already rousing itself, winning more major union organizing campaigns in the last 12 months than in the previous 10 years. The U.S. labor movement is already energized by the inflationary surge. If that energy is leavened now with the possibility of further advances, if workers sense that immigration restriction will swing labor markets further their way, then trade unions will continue their climb back into relevance. Moreover, an intriguing phalanx of pro-worker advocates has emerged in the Republican Senate. One of its vocal leaders has been Senator and now Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. In his speech accepting the GOP nomination for Vice President, Vance talked again and again about putting the needs of Main Street over the needs of Wall Street. Historically, this kind of thinking, or I should say, this kind of talk, constitutes heresy in the GOP. That it has entered the public realm may be one reason why working-class voters of all races voted for Trump to a greater degree than anyone had anticipated. I am not ready to proclaim that a major political realignment is underway. With the likes of the anti-union Elon Musk now having Trump's ear, such mainstream discourse may soon be snuffed out, and the GOP's working-class swerve may quickly disappear. I do want to suggest, and this is the thought I want to leave you with, that the shift in working-class party allegiances evident in the 2024 vote offers strong evidence that the forces unleashed by the breakup of the neoliberal order continue to convulse politics in powerful and surprising ways. The United States, it turns out, is still very much in transition away from its once vaunted neoliberal order. There will be further twists and turns before we can, with confidence, say that a new political order has implanted itself on American soil. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, professor Gary Gusto, pela conferência estimulante. Eu vou resumir os meus comentários, porque nosso tempo não é tão longo, em vista da necessidade de fechar. Maria Antônia, nós temos que sair às 7, é isso? Então, nós temos 20 minutos, basicamente. Então, eu vou fazer algumas observações breves e imediatamente abrir a palavra para que todos possam se manifestar, todas e todos. Algo que foi a primeira impressão que eu tive logo depois de terminar o livro do professor Gunston era o quanto nós nos iludimos com a metáfora do pêndulo. Ou seja, a ideia de que nós tínhamos uma ordem liberal, depois nós temos uma ordem que é uma ordem do New Deal, ou do welfare state, no caso europeu, ou do nacional desenvolvimentismo, né, na América Latina, e que depois nós temos um momento neoliberal e que agora nós vamos ter algo parecido com o New Deal, ou com o welfare state, ou com o nacional desenvolvimentismo na América Latina. Eu tenho a impressão de que tudo que nós ouvimos hoje diz que isso não é possível. E que essa metáfora do pêndulo, que muitas vezes está funcionando na nossa cabeça, é alguma coisa que nos impede de ver o que está acontecendo. Ou seja, que existe um bloqueio político para a imaginação, né? Para a imaginação que nós estamos tentando liberar. Então, a minha primeira pergunta ao professor Gerstel é justamente se acredita que essa metáfora do pêndulo ela está realmente impregnada na cabeça do que a gente pode chamar de um projeto de esquerda, de centro-esquerda, progressista, o que seja. Também gostaria de perguntar sobre aquilo que o professor Gusto disse que não tem resposta, que não iria falar, porque a gente precisa aproveitar a situação para obrigá-lo a pensar alto com a gente, certo? Então, é muito importante no livro a transformação de um movimento político para uma ordem política. É muito importante esse argumento no livro e a descrição das duas ordens, da ordem do New Deal e da ordem neoliberal. Então, como o final do texto nos diz que nós não temos ainda uma ordem política instaurada, a minha conclusão é que nós estamos num movimento político, não é? Então, se seria possível identificar, não talvez 2, talvez 3 movimentos políticos que poderiam se representar essa nova ordem. E eu penso nisso particularmente porque tem uma distinção no livro do professor Gerstel que eu acho extraordinária, que é a distinção entre dentro do neoliberalismo, 2 projetos que têm um acordo de base sobre a política econômica, mas que divergem em todo o resto, certo? Que são os neovitorianos e os cosmopolitas. Então, os neo-vitorianos, ele vai buscar Gertrude Himmelfarb, o seu marido, que vem no Reagan a representação da Rainha Vitória na União, da Rainha Vitória lá do século XIX no Reino Unido, com a união de família e mercado, e depois os cosmopolitas, a partir do governo Bill Clinton, que tentam trazer todas as pautas igualitárias para dentro do neoliberalismo sem questionar a sua base econômica. E que, como nós sabemos, a professora Nancy Fraser chama de neoliberalismo progressista. Certo? Então, para perguntar, será que essas duas vertentes do neoliberalismo elas não estão se reconfigurando no momento atual como dois movimentos políticos que pretendem instaurar uma nova ordem política, ou nós não podemos chegar a esse ponto? A segunda característica muito importante, eu acho, do livro é essa ênfase no papel da União Soviética. Eu acho que eu não li nenhum outro livro no qual isso seja tão importante, e eu acho que é um ganho intelectual muito grande a gente colocar a União Soviética no centro do século XX, certo? Tanto para a ordem do New Deal quanto para a ordem neoliberal. E quando a gente pensa nas analogias que têm sido feitas no momento atual sobre a República de Weimar, sobre o fascismo e o nazismo na década de 20, quando são feitas essas analogias, nós tendemos a esquecer que existiam 3 possibilidades, né? E não 2, né? Que existia a União Soviética, e que isso foi fundamental para moldar as duas ordens. Então, eu pergunto, e talvez a consequência da minha pergunta seja dramaticamente desesperadora, na ausência da União Soviética, de que maneira é possível uma nova ordem que seja mais próxima do New Deal, ou mais próxima do welfare state, ou mais próxima, não vou dizer do nacional-desenvolvimentismo, porque o nosso nacional-desenvolvimentismo era de um grau de brutalidade política e de exclusão social que a gente não quer rever, mas com um certo espírito, como nós vimos hoje, de uma cidadania que vai se ampliando. Se a ausência da União Soviética no momento atual e de algo comparável, porque nós não podemos comparar a China com a União Soviética. A China não é um modelo exportável, né, e nem pretende ser exportável como era a União Soviética, se isso não diminui as chances para um projeto progressista, certo? Ou como a gente queira chamar. Então, todas as outras 18 questões que eu tinha aqui, eu vou deixar para uma próxima ocasião, já agradecendo ao professor Gustl a atenção, e abro, então, para as perguntas de vocês. Por favor, aproveitem a oportunidade.
Thanks a lot, Professor. Giuliano Fiore, Alameda. The end of the illusions that the progressive neoliberal pact could represent a return to progress of some sort seemed to coincide with the financial crisis. But why do you think the movements that came as a result of that end of illusions ultimately tended more to the right? That is, why was there a more sustained ascendancy of movements that was also more popular on the right than a successful expansion of insurgencies on the left? Do you think it is because of the absence of a Soviet Union, because of organic tendencies within capitalism itself, because of new political technologies that the right tapped into more? Which explanation would you give? Thanks.
Professor, in the book you talked about, obviously, talking about the neoliberal order, the cosmopolitan view and the neo-Victorian way in this trade from Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. But 2 weeks ago, following Trump's re-election, Bernie Sanders commented on Twitter that maybe the Democrats or the liberals should abandon the Democratic Party. Do you think that in this wake of a possibility of a new order, there's a possibility that a third party or something like that, or something similar to the New Left movement that you talked about in the 60s could happen again and influence the wake of this new order that you talked about today? Thank you.
Very quickly, and thank you, Gary Gerstle, that was fantastic. You may recall that in The Economist magazine, when Thomas Kuhn died, they titled his obituary that Kuhn goes for his final paradigm shift, which is one of their great successes. But what I wanted to ask you, because you didn't talk about paradigm shift, you just talked about paradigm, and this is also for Marcos too. What's the difference between a paradigm and a hegemonic ideology?
My question is, when communism or the Soviet Union was constructed as the other that had to be, deterred or held back, and then whose absence now kind of opened up the space for others to tread in and mess things. There was always also a dimension of symbolic construction. I mean, the Soviet Union or the European region that geopolitically gravitated around the Soviet Union never really measured up to their own self-definition of socialism, and probably they would never really be able to threaten the powers of the West. So there was an element of symbolic construction that made the Soviet Union into this kind of huge adversarial enemy to be fought. Yeah? Now, if that is the case, you do have a real actor, but you also have an interpretation that is built around its threatening, possibility. Now, what would be the situation in this context in which you speak of a failure or a collapse of the neoliberal order? I mean, where would this adversary come from that would hold together the other side?
Well, thank you very much for this brilliant lecture, and I also enjoyed your book a lot, which I did read. But I found a significant gap in your book and also in your lecture today, and that is exactly the gap of a gap of the issues that we discussed in one of the previous panels, which is climate, and and some other problems of humanity which are connected to climate, and such as demographic issues, overpopulation. They are deeply, intrinsically connected to the problems of neoliberal order. And when and if it will fail probably because of that issue. So I think there is some kind of theoretical motivation under this perceived gap.
You've given me an impossible task.
Yes.
These are fantastic questions, which I wish we could discuss for an hour. How much time do I have? Like 5 minutes?
No, 7.
7.
Yes.
I do. I'm not a pendulum kind of historian.
No.
In the sense that what swings right must swing left, and what swings left must swing right. So I know my work can be interpreted as implying that, but there's no law or law of history that I have discovered that says the collapse of the neoliberal order will be followed by a progressive order, or that it will be followed by an order at all. In other words, the orders that I have examined over the last 100 years may be history. They may be of the last 100 years, and they may not be repeating themselves. As I think of how long it took the neoliberal order to emerge from the wreckage of the New Deal order, it took about 20 years, from the 15 to 20 years, from the 1970s until the late 80s and into the mid-90s. We are at that temporal point of time now with regard to the emergence of a new order, and that new order has not successfully established itself, which may be an indication of us living in a period of extended political volatility in which, I hate to say this, the concept of political order might not be that useful. In other words, there may be a different political terrain emerging. So that is what I can say about that. And I think there are all kinds of interesting political movements emerging. We ought to have a conference on political movements emerging on the left and not just on the right. But why do we focus so much on political movements on the right? We, the generous we, includes the United States and Brazil at minimum. And I think that is because the right seems to have a kind of energy. This came up in the previous session, right? Why is the right so much more successful in social media than the left? And one of the answers was the left are rule followers. There was a long period of time when liberal social democrats and the left were in the driver's seat of politics globally, and the right could not establish itself. And it felt, I think, the way we feel now. We have good ideas. They ought to be more popular than they are. And I've had multiple discussions here with those of you paying close attention to Brazilian politics, which mirror the discussions I have in the United States, which suggests that we're talking about a global phenomenon. Why can we identify the right-wing authoritarian movements, leaders in the world so much more easily than those who are on the left? What is going on here? There's a global story going on. And is it Juliano or Giuliano? Yeah. Giuliano. I guess in Portugal it's Giuliano. I mean in Brazil. I'm sorry, I'm tired. And this relates to the communist question, because the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism was a symbol. It was not just a collapse of a country, an empire, a political economy. It was a collapse of a dream. Now, you can say that the communist dream died long before the Soviet Union disappeared, but seen from a different perspective, the dream of socialist emancipation animated the left for almost the entirety of the 20th century. And to suffer a kind of loss and wreckage that we've seen in the Soviet Union has disoriented the left in profound ways. The left will recover that dreaminess at some point in the future, but I think we have to start with reckoning with the magnitude of the loss and the disorientation of the left in the 1990s. And this is also bound up with the left becoming so associated with identity politics from the 1990s forward. These identity politics are extraordinarily important, but we still must reckon with the difficulty the left has had in developing a popular left politics of political economy that would fire the imagination. This is one of the things I'm trying to understand more about what just happened in the United States, because Biden should have had more support than he did for the economic transformation that he has been trying to engineer. And yet and you step outside the United States is the economic envy of the world right now. You step into the United States, Biden ended with 37% approval rating on his management of the economy. What is going on here? So I think there's a story of failure and exhaustion that we have to reckon with while building a sense of going forward and rebuilding our imagination. And we are at the right place for rebuilding our imagination. This is absolutely critical work with the understanding that and this is hard for me to say as well as a historian, the past is not a sure guide to the future. We must understand the past and then free ourselves from it. What can take the place of the Soviet Union in terms of putting a check on capitalist ambitions? I don't know. It's not China doesn't function, as you said, it doesn't function in the same way. It is not a world revolutionary force. The question that's often asked about America is, why is American labor historically weak? The question, better question may be, why is American capital so aggressively powerful? And the one period in which it was forced to really relinquish some of that power was during the period of the Soviet Union's presence on the earth, and the power that American capital had claimed for itself has now been renewed. And for those of us who study the American past, it resembles in a lot of ways the late 19th and early 20th century. And so it's not, I don't have an answer for you, and I get this question a lot: what takes the place of the Soviet Union as a constraint on the power of global capital? If any of you have an answer to that question before I leave Brazil on Saturday, please let me know what it is. If I was writing this book 2 or 3 years later, I would not have been able to avoid the climate issue. It still was avoidable when I was writing it, and avoidable is not the right word. I had so much to reckon with, but if I had to, one always asks, this is a great question to ask an author: how would you rewrite the book you wrote 5 or 10 years ago? And if I were to rewrite the book now, the place of climate in policy in the neoliberal age would have to be integral to it, and so too the restlessness and anger and fear that populates the world because of the possible end of the planet is affecting all politics now. Clearly it's affecting politics on the left because they have made it part of their program, but I think it's affecting politics on the right. Building a wall in the US on the southern border is a rehearsal for climate catastrophe, because one of the approaches to climate catastrophe is when there are 100 or 200 million refugees in the world who are in motion because land has literally disappeared from under their feet, or because the subsistence agriculture they have been doing is no longer sustainable and marginable. Where are they going to go? And the countries that have wherewithal, their question is going to be, who are we going to let in? And the right has an answer to that question. I'm not sure the left does. And one of the urgent issues for the left to grapple with is, what is a left climate policy that, on the one hand, is deeply humanitarian and recognizes the fundamental equality of all peoples, and yet deals with the world of climate catastrophe that is coming. I think I've left the difference between paradigm and hegemony at the end, so I don't have to answer it right now. But it's you are a master of the pithy, profound question, and if we have a chance to talk about it, it's something I've thought quite a lot about, and it's something we ought to talk about. And also, Tom Kuhn everyone should read The Structure of Scientific, anyone interested in paradigms should read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a book published in the 1960s. But that is the source of the spread of paradigm from the scientific world to the world in which we inhabit. And for aspiring young scholars with an intellectual bent, your assignment leaving this room is to systematically compare Gramsci and Kuhn, hegemony and paradigm, as useful concepts of analysis going forward. Should Sanders abandon the Democratic Party? No. There has been one successful third-party effort in all of American history. What is that? Jackson. No, I was part of the he changed the Democratic Party. One successful insurgent party replaced an existing second party in American history.
George Wallace.
No, he wasn't successful. Yeah. The Republican Party. the Republican Party.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it replaced the Whigs. Given America's electoral system, it's almost impossible to establish a third party and have it be successful. And I know there's a lot of discussion in the U.S. now that Harris made a mistake veering toward the center. She should have veered toward the left, and the Democrats would have won. I see it differently. I think the Bernie Sanders moment had already peaked 2021, 2022, and has been in decline. And I think the more relevant, the question that I would want to ask, because I don't think if the Democratic Party had veered left, they would have won the election. I think the more relevant question is a question that has already come up, which is, it's not a U.S. question, it's a global question. What would it take to put, for the left to fire the imaginations of people the way the right is demonstrating an inability to do? And I think that's one of the most urgent questions of our time, and an answer must both have a particular national focus, and it must be able to travel globally, since this is not one nation's problem. It's a condition of the world in which we live, and firing the imaginations of people with social democratic and left projects, I would say, is one of the most urgent issues the world faces, and we must find a way to move toward that destination. And these kinds of discussions, I'm leaving you with more questions than answers, I realize, but these kinds of discussions are essential to getting us there.
Perfect. Thank you very much.